Cool. So thanks everybody for coming bright and early and eating All Makers food. I'm going to talk today about how TES grows engineers. So, who am I? I'm David Morgantini. Previously, I was a lead consultant at ThoughtWorks and the lead engineer on the WK Verify. So you can pretty much blame me for anything that goes wrong if you happen to have to use that. And I'm currently the VP of Engineering at TES, which is an ed tech company from 1913. So you may have heard of it if you know any teachers in your life. So the question is, the first thing is, why are we here, right? Why has anybody actually come to this meeting aside from the food? The first point is probably you care about people, right? You actually want to help people. And you probably want to have great people working for you. And you know that good people will grow into great people. And you want to motivate people, right? So these are probably the three of the big reasons that you're here. But if we really boil it down, the real reason you're here is because of retention. You want to keep people, right? You're spending a lot of money and a lot of time to hire people, and you want them to stay. And so this is something that's actually quite important to me. And part of the reason that it's important to me is because of this number here, which is the cost of replacing an employee. So if we really think of what it boils down to, it's actually money. We want to retain people because it costs us money to bring them in. And that number is quite a large number. That's in American dollars. You can see all of the calculations in this link, and I'm sure the slides will be shared out at some point so you don't have to scribble it down. But yeah, it's a big number, and therefore it's quite important to think about retention. And one of the things around retention is that growth is a huge part of retention. Lots of people tend to leave if they're not growing or they don't have opportunities for growth. And one of the things to think about for an engineer is, in general, you pretty much have 5 possible promotions in your entire career. So you can't actually put a carrot in front of somebody and say, hey, you're going to be here for 5 years and you get promoted 3 times, because that doesn't actually exist. If you start at junior, go to intermediate, senior, lead, and architect, maybe, or VP, right? So you really have a limited number of actual promotions that you can give, ways you can actually focus on career development. So we have to look at it a different way. So let's take a quick step back. This is TES Engineering. This is a team that were here last week. We have engineers in 6 countries right now. So they all came to London last week, and it was pretty crazy. But the team has grown quite substantially. In 2015, when I first joined TES, there were about 10 perm engineers, a whole bunch of contractors. The following year, we grew up to 22 perm engineers, and following that, now we have 48, with a view to get up to 55. So we've grown quite a lot, right? Which has actually meant that what I've done has changed, but the core of it will stay the same. So if we talk about retention, in 2015, we only had about 50% retention. That was mainly because we changed from .NET to Node, and a lot of the engineers weren't actually able to make that switch. So we kind of shrunk really quickly. But then in the following year, we had 4 people leave. So another 3 .NET engineers ended up leaving. And we had 1 Node.js engineer leave, which is actually kind of a bit of a kick in the balls, because it was the first day I just got in the title VP of Engineering, and he's like, yeah, I'm going to quit. So that kind of sucked. But still, 81%, not too bad. And then this last year, we've had 94% retention, where I've had 3 people leave. And just to say that we haven't had any, like, this isn't all good for us. We did have 1 engineer leave for a bad reason, which was that I couldn't recognize him as he wanted to be recognized, which was unfortunate. So we're doing something right. It's not to say everything is perfect, and nothing about what I'm going to say. It's not just what I'm going to say, but we're definitely doing something there. So retention does require more than just growth, and there's 3 aspects that I focus on as part of my job as a VP of Engineering. The first one is hiring smart people. This is actually relatively easy, in that you just have to find them and get them in and then interview and so on and so forth. But it's pretty easy to understand how you do that. The second one is to keep them motivated. And this is where it really gets hard. This is where you need to start to think about each individual and how do you drive them and how do you keep them engaged in your organization. And the last part is to get out of their way. This is actually also really easy. So if you have motivated, smart people, then you just let them do their thing and away they go, and they don't tend to leave. So I want to focus in on that middle, wait a second. Right, so let's talk about motivation really quickly. Again, this is that key aspect of of retention and how I work. So there's a book written by a man named Daniel Pink called Drive. If you haven't read it and you are in a leadership role, it is probably worth a drive. If you don't worth a read. If you don't have time to read, there's a 10-minute YouTube video that's actually kind of summarizes the whole thing, and it's really quite a good way to save yourself a bunch of time. And this kind of focuses on three aspects of motivation. So the first aspect is purpose. So, and I'm not going to get into all of these, but basically for purpose, you want to have a vision at all levels. You want to make sure that everybody understands why they're doing it, whether it's on the team or at the business level and the whole way through. Autonomy, you need to foster intent-driven autonomy. So it's not just giving kids, your 2-year-old a pair of scissors and saying go. It's actually about focusing on what you actually want them to do, like cut the wrapping paper, and helping them with at the levels that you have. These two things, purpose and autonomy, are definitely 25-minute talks in and of themselves, so we're not going to touch on them anymore today. But the last one is mastery, and mastery is basically people want to grow, right? And so if you focus on these three aspects, then you're going to help motivate your people, and they're going to stay. So we're going to talk about mastery. So some history. So I started at ThoughtWorks, and one of the things that I found when I was working at ThoughtWorks was that there was a really difficult question that people had, which was, how do I move from a senior consultant to a lead consultant? What does that actually take for me to do? And there was a lot of subjectivity in it, and that's how I felt when I was at the time, and also how I felt when I was a lead consultant helping others trying to come up to be a lead consultant as well. It felt very subjective to me. And then when I came to TES, and suddenly this opportunity arose for me to actually start to support engineers, I started to think, well, how am I going to be supporting these engineers in this growth? So way back when I was in ThoughtWorks, I actually built a tool, or built a spreadsheet. So that's all this was, is a spreadsheet. And we'll go through, this looks complicated, so don't stress too much about actually reading anything. We'll go through it in quite a lot of detail. But it basically was a tool that I started to say to consultants at ThoughtWorks, this is where you are when you get to be a senior consultant or a lead consultant and so on. It didn't really go very far. It was just kind of something I used with a few engineers. But when I got to TES, we kind of built it out. And now, as you can see, it actually is a tool in and of itself and not just a spreadsheet anymore. It also looks very complicated. Again, I will go through it in a bit more detail. So the first thing we need to think about when we're actually building a tool like this is what actually makes an engineer. And I kind of, in my career, I've found that there's 4 major axes of an engineer. The first one is technical skill, right? So this is really the fundamental skill for an engineer. It's the reading and writing of code, designing software, and making it run, right? Without that, you basically are not an engineer. Then there's a system delivery part of engineering, which is actually the part where you are going to draw boxes and arrows and architecture and making the whole thing work and not fall over and monitoring and that kind of stuff. There's leadership, which is around making sure people follow you and do the right things and providing intent and owning things and mentoring, enabling, and those sorts of stuff. And then there's engagement. So how engaged is an engineer, whether in their community or in TES as a company, right? So you take those 4 things, and those kind of are the core aspects of what makes an engineer, and we start to put those across the top, right? So we'll have the technical skill area, software delivery, leadership, and engagement. And we kind of lay these across the top of our spreadsheet or our tool or whatever. Now we've broken them down further than this. So in our spreadsheet, we have 5 different categories under technical skill, 2 under software delivery, 3 in leadership, and 2 in engagement. So this is kind of how you can start to visualize an engineer. Then we need to start to think about how do people gain skills. And in 1980, a couple of brothers suggested the Dreyfus model of skills acquisition. You may have heard of this before. It's quite common in terms of the coaching and when people start to think about coaching and stuff. This is quite a common model. And it basically suggests a path that students get when they increase their skill set, right? So this works quite well when I start to think about, well, what skills does an engineer have? But these particular grades that the Dreyfus model suggests don't really fit how I view things. So we've made some slight modifications to it. And basically, the way it works right now is for each one of those things across the top, you would have each one of these grades. So you start at novice, which is a bare minimum. You could basically barely do anything. Then you get to move on to experienced beginner, which is where you need to have some guidance, but you are actually able to do something. Independently successful, which is where I can basically do things by myself. And then knowledgeable is where you're kind of moving up above that. You're more effective. You may be able to coach and teach the things that you're independently successful in. And then advanced. Now, I don't believe in expert because very few people are an expert in anything. So that's why we prefer advanced over expert. So the next thing we do is we're going to start to layer on this skills growth. So you see those across the side of the skills matrix. And this is kind of where we start to see a shape to this, which is that spreadsheet that I showed you earlier. So the next thing we need to look at is, what is a skill? A skill is essentially a demonstrable quality of an engineer that you as a company value. It is not interesting to me if somebody at TES is good at Rust as a language. It's not interesting to me, or R, or any of these other programming languages that engineers can be good at. Because at TES, I need people to do Node.js. So no skill outside of Node.js is represented in our skills matrix. And that's that. You might be coming in with 30 years of C++ experience, but that's not valuable to me if you can't write any Node.js. Is something that we care about at TES, that things can do. And you can see through this that some of them are technical skills, some are behaviors in a way, like proactively works to improve your code base, some are soft skills, facilitating meetings, some are really soft skills, like coaching other people, and so on. Okay, so we kind of identify what skills demonstrates a good engineer at TES, and again, more coaching type skills. Okay, so these are skills as we have defined them at TES. And each skill has a certain set of things. So a skill has a name. The name has to be unique, descriptive, and relatively short. All right. So for example, in this case, able to large-scale redesign. So this is something that you want somebody to be able to do if they're a senior engineer at your company. Now, unfortunately, that is actually somewhat subjective, right? Like, people are going to look at that and be like, yeah, of course I can, because I rebuilt this tiny little service into this other little service, and yay, I'm great at that. So we need to go a little bit deeper than just having the title. So we also add acceptance criteria. And so this is descriptive and specific to the things that a person has actually done. So for example, in this particular case, again, that skill that we had earlier, is the engineer has demonstrated a capability to redesign an existing system to better handle new requirements. Now, this isn't necessarily perfect. I'm not calling this one a perfect acceptance criteria. These continuously evolve as we go along. So they're always changing slightly. And then beyond that, we also add clarification questions. So the clarification questions are formed as questions. And basically, the intent behind these is that if the answer to any of these is no, you probably don't have the skill. If the answer to all of them is yes, then assuming you have the acceptance criteria, then you're probably safe to say, yes, I have this skill. Right? So basically, what we're trying to do is take these skills away from a subjective title and bring them to a really objective measurement that you can use to actually evaluate yourself, and other people can use to evaluate you and give you feedback, and so on and so forth. So that's going to look like this, especially when you're using the tool. In a spreadsheet, we would just have the name and acceptance criteria, because adding questions to that becomes a little bit tedious. So at this point, we're going to mix in the skills. So we're going to have skills at every different level. Ideally, the skills are going to grow on each other, i.e. you shouldn't be able to have the skills in a advanced leadership skills if you don't have some independently successful skills. So what you're looking for is progression, so that you can actually help people progress through these areas that you've identified as important to you. And if you have built something like this and you're looking, you have people inside the advanced, people getting advanced engagement skills, and they don't have any of the independently successful skills, or only have a few of them, you've probably done something wrong in how you define that skill or what you're actually telling people, and you need to think about that. So you bake for 30 minutes, and out of the oven comes this lovely, massive spreadsheet. Now in hours, we have 170 skills. The key thing to keep in mind for that is that we've been building it for about 5 years all told. So if you consider from when I started building it at ThoughtWorks to what we have now, it's about 5 years of evolution. You don't have to go through a 5-year phase, because obviously what I was doing was exploring how it actually worked, while you can start, if you just get it and get what the concepts I'm trying to explain, you could really start much quicker than that. So what do you get if you do this? And there's 4 main areas that you can get value from this. And especially because, as you saw, it is a fair chunk of work. I mean, it obviously wasn't 5 years of just working on it, but it is still work and requires effort. So what do you get? You get to track growth. So yeah, the first thing is tracking growth. So what's interesting, this is a real life example of one of our junior engineers. You can see here, this is initial evaluation. What you see at the bottom, and I apologize if it's hard to read and the skills aren't important, but what you can see at the bottom is that he had, so all these blue boxes are the skills that he's attained. And you can see that he wasn't terribly skilled. He had he wasn't terrible, but he was definitely a junior, okay? Because what you're looking at here is at the bottom's a novice, experienced beginner, independently successful, knowledgeable, and then I kind of cut out the advanced section. This is 6 months later. So all of a sudden, what I'm seeing here is this person is actually growing. And we can have a conversation around that growth. And we can talk about how he's growing. And I can say, hey, look, this person's growing. Okay, he's maybe not an engineer yet, but he's getting there. And then 6 months later, you still see further growth. And what we're starting to realize, okay, wait a second, this is a junior engineer. I probably should consider retaining him because he's actually really quite good and he's driving. And this isn't like some subjective measure of somebody said, oh yeah, that guy's good because I happen to like him. This is an objective measure where I can look at this person and say, yes, this person's growing. And so that I can go to HR and say, look, this person's growing. We don't want to lose him. And that to me is extremely valuable. The next aspect is around salary discussions because that kind of leads into the salary discussions. So I'm going to show 2 examples. So this is example engineer number 1. Again, the details don't matter. Ignore the colors. All that's interesting is actually the skills that are covered. This particular engineer makes £52,000. And this engineer makes £60,000. And what you might notice between the two is that the engineer making £52,000 is actually more skilled than the engineer making £60,000. And this is interesting. There's actually several sets of reasons why you might end up in a situation like this. The first one, which is actually the case in this case, is location. One of those engineers happens to live in Edinburgh. The other lives in London. So there's a difference in cost there. But what you also have to think is, could somebody be lying? Of course, these are somewhat subjective. So you need to consider, let me make sure we need to have systems in place to make sure that people are, that there's a backup for people. So when you're doing, after you do a self-evaluation, you actually have some degree of value of checking on it. And there's a variety of other reasons, but what you really need to get to is a conversation. It provides you the value to be able to have that conversation around somebody. So if this person at 60,000 says, I want 70,000, I'm going to look across the rest of my engineers who are all making around 60,000 and say, what do you have that these people don't have that makes you worth 70,000 to me? And I need to, unfortunately, I have 5 minutes left, so I need to move a little bit quickly. So the next area is identifying growth areas. So this is a snapshot of my particular skills matrix. And what you're seeing is 2 areas of front-end engineering, which if anybody ever asked me to do front-end, you would laugh at them, and operations. But what we can do is say this was somebody else, not me, who's obviously not writing code or writing a lot less code these days. You can actually start to identify areas where you want them to grow, right? And you can say, okay, well, this person is somebody that we actually want to be able to do some more operation stuff or should be able to write front-end engineering. So these are the areas that we want you to focus on growing over the next 6 months. You also get to identify team skill gaps. So this is 3 different engineers, each one of whom has set an objective to get an in-depth understanding of web security. So maybe there's something here where I need to bring in somebody to teach web security across my team. This is a hand-generated heat map, which looks awful on this presentation. But basically what it allows you to see is if you were to generate a heat map of all of the different people in your organization, you'd start to be able to identify areas where perhaps you have weakness. Maybe you need to hire somebody. Maybe you need to bring in specific coaching or something like that to address those particular areas. And the last thing, which is kind of what we'd started to talk with, is career progression. So this is an example of a junior engineer, a different junior engineer using the new tool. Or no, sorry, this is a spreadsheet as well. And this is kind of a starting point. At this point, you can't see anywhere that the engineer is going to go. But what we can do is we have another heat map. This is a heat map of engineers. And this is how I can start to say, okay, listen, junior engineer, if you want to be an engineer, these are the key skills that you need to have. You start with these, and then we'll have a discussion. But you have to at least get these, because an engineer at TES has at least these skills. If you don't have these skills, you're probably not an engineer yet. There still is a discussion that needs to happen, because as I'll show you in the next slide, we have 2 senior engineers. We have a senior engineer here, which is a full stack engineer, lots of technical skill, but less so on the pushing up on the leadership or software engineering, software delivery side. And then we have another senior engineer, but this particular senior engineer is purely front-end focused, right? So when I say you have a conversation, you can get a conversation, it does provide scaffolding for the conversation, but it's not like a hard, fast rule which says, unless you have all these skills, you're a senior engineer, because you will lose people if you say you're not a senior engineer. They're like, but I'm missing one bloody box, right? That's just, that doesn't work. So how can you do this? So the first thing to call out is that this is loads of work. You have to create skills, you have to make them objective, you have to run evaluations, whoopsies. You have to update your skills as they go along. You have to manage the whole thing. So it's not super easy, but it's doable. But the key thing to come back to is that cost of losing one engineer. So if having something like this saves you one engineer, then it's worth £65,000, right? And that to me is something that's really important. And that's why we do it, in spite of the fact that it does take up a fair chunk of my work. And the other thing is, and I recognize that this statistic is a little bit subjective, as I asked them in person, and they might have all just wanted to make me feel really good about myself. But every single engineer that I talked to found it to be valuable to them, including people who were very skeptical to start with, because they really felt that it helped them hone in on their growth and focus on the things that were important to them. So the first thing you need to do is start with a spreadsheet, define your categories, decide a progression plan. You can simplify it. You can have high-level categories. You can have levels, like just level 1, 2, 3. I like the Dreyfus model or similar, because it kind of speaks to how I see people grow, but it will be entirely up to you. The next thing to do is ask the engineers at your company what they do, right? Get an understanding of the skills that people do have, and use that to start your skills matrix. And then you can start to grow that. Grow it from there. But make sure you start simple. Don't try to start with 170 skills, because you'll never get there. Well, you will eventually, but it'll take some time. Start with 60 or 50 or less, right? And then at TES, what we do is on joining, you'll do a partnered self-evaluation. So I'll sit down with every new engineer and we'll work through it for them, so that they at least have an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. So they're not just reading stuff and being like, oh, I don't know what this means. So we at least have somebody to talk to start with. Then every 6 months, we run a self-evaluation. So they'll first do it by themselves. Then they do a review with their mentor. The mentor is a person that gives them one-to-ones every 2 weeks. And then they'll do a review with their manager. Okay? So this kind of gives you that backstop, so that people, both ways, some people will be like, yeah, I don't really attain that. I'll look at a skill and be like, of course you've attained that, right? I mean, you just simply didn't understand the question, or you're not feeling good enough about yourself. So these are basically two steps to make sure that people are both picking the right objectives, as well as making sure they're being as accurate as possible. And every month, the manager is going to meet them and focus on the skills growth. So you set a set of objectives, of growth objectives. How are you actually going to achieve them? And every month, their manager, who we call principal engineers, will meet with them and make sure that they're actually focusing on their growth as well. And then you rinse and repeat. And part of this is the actual reviewing of the skills and adding or removing skills. So as you get a better understanding of what the role actually looks like, you're going to be adding stuff, you're going to be removing stuff, and so on. So in terms of scaling, you've got a spreadsheet, and now what? So one person can manage about 6 to 8 spreadsheets. And then you can also handle changes to the thing and tracking growth. So basically, if you saw the colors I had before, a lot of that is about tracking the growth, tracking people's growth, and being able to view that. One person can deal with about 6 to 8. I dealt with 18, and it was a nightmare. So I would not suggest going above 6 to 8. I do know there's another company that does something very similar. They have 300 engineers, and they do it like this. They have a spreadsheet. Every person does a small number of people. Otherwise, you can actually handle more if you're not changing your skills, which is a really bad idea, or you want to be able to look at multiple spreadsheets to see people's growth, which is fine as well, right? So you can just have one base template, and then every time you do an evaluation, clone it and say go. And then if you want to see somebody's growth, you look at this one, and then you look at that one, and you're like, oh, okay, you've grown. So that works as well. The alternative that you have is that TES has open sourced a tool. It is the MVP for it. Basically, it provides everything that I need to be able to run this for a team of about 45 engineers. But it does work. And if you are interested in trying to use that, then please let me know. My details are here. And I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has. So thank you very much.